Past Investigated. Welcome to the Historical Detective Agency, your stop for journeying back in time to examine history as an investigator would.
And welcome. It is... Where am I? There I am. All right. We'll get this down. It is April 20th, 2025. It is 7:48 p.m. And currently we have an interesting one today. We just thought we'd do a special one to talk about a couple of things that came up. Number one was the issue that we have with a couple of videos that have come out. And we saw a lot of videos, and usually we don't really address them, but a number of people actually sent it to us, and we said, okay, we'll do a special one that they can actually use and watch and that sort of thing. What this basically is there have been claims, there's all kind of claims about World War II. Few topics in modern history are as clouded by misinformation actually as World War II. And that's despite it being one of the most documented and studied periods in all of history. Few wars ever were as documented as World War II. And I deployed twice in Operation Iraqi Freedom. And, looking back, we didn't have as much documentation as World War II does when you actually hit the archives, especially on the United States side. It was absolutely phenomenal, the amount of pretty much S1 work and clerk work that was put into it at all levels. And even on the civilian side, there was massive documentation before, during, and after. That's been pretty much unmatched in any conflict since then. The other advantage that World War II has for historical research is that it's all on paper. A lot of documents from, for example, the beginning of Operation Iraqi Freedom, even though it was only 20 years ago, the information from that is on 3.5-inch floppy on Lotus notes on an operating system that nobody uses anymore. And so the physical medium is there, but there's no way to access it without going through a lot of problems. Whereas World War II, it's paper. I can just read it. So there's a huge discrepancy. Even still, with all of that advantage that World War II has, it's clouded by misinformation. There's mischaracterizations and glaring omissions all over the place on all sides. And the things that exacerbate some of the problems that we have is that there's a lot of little sound bites that go through. And this is generally for most topics that everybody wants either a TikTok video, a YouTube short, something short, snappy that they can watch in their feed in about 10 to 15 seconds. And that's supposed to inform them on topics that have a lot of context and a lot of deep history that needs to be understood. Now, why is there so much misinformation aside from the social media, the short kind of soundbite narrative? But there's still a lot that drives it. Even if you get a lot of books, especially some of the, your what I call pop history books, you'll see that there's a lot of misinformation that's kind of baked in, even though the person should know better. They have access to all the archives. They have access to pretty much everything that, that's out there, except if you go to like the Soviet Union or China, then your archives are kind of limited in what you can see. But if you're studying Japan, Germany, America, and to some extent Britain, as long as you don't go too far back or too much in the clandestine operations, you can get everything. You can get all the archives. Everything is open to you there. But nevertheless, these myths and misperceptions still persist. Some of the causes of this, of course, are residual wartime propaganda. And it's a feel-good propaganda for a lot of nations. And they keep holding on to those myths. Some of those myths, the propaganda hasn't been rightly corrected after the war, unfortunately. And we're still using a lot of those propaganda tropes in our histories today. There's also a lot of fashionable geopolitical whims. World War II has become kind of a foundational myth within the collective consciousness of not only America, but a lot of other countries and political subgroups, both within and outside of America. And so all of this kind of combines together with things like academic gain, the normal, tribalism that occurs in history, and things like the lack of modern experience with war and fundamental misunderstanding of what human organizational behavior actually is. And so in general, all of these kind of combined to make World War II really a myth versus, an actual historical event that can be studied objectively. This kind of emotion that we have put into World War II and the stories that we have ingrained into it, in some cases where the stories don't really match the record, creates a problem, because when you go in there and you say, okay, let's look at the facts and let's kind of debate and see what these things are, it creates a huge emotional response, and in some cases political response. in some cases, a national level response to kind of bust those myths. For example, if you look at World War II in the Soviet Union and you correctly begin to assess some of the evidence and you say, well, wait a minute, actually, without the tremendous amount of U.S. material, the Soviets probably could not do a lot of the campaigns that they did. Up to 70 to 80% of the wheeled transport that they were using in some campaigns came from America, if not America itself, American factories that we had established in Iran and that we were moving up in places such as Stalingrad to be able to go in there because we needed to feed the Soviet Union a tremendous amount of war material to keep it in the fight, so to speak. But that will run up against modern political sensibilities. And you have, basically Russian or pro-Russian nationalistic or patriotic folks that will push back against that simply on modern geopolitical ideals because they believe it has something to do with the Ukraine war when you're just talking, okay, this is logistics, we're just take lessons learned. And so the problem is it's so entangled in the emotions of today, it's very difficult to kind of go through and to look at these issues and get a good lesson learned. And that's the problem, is that if we don't look at it for a lesson learned, now if you're just telling it to a story for grandmother or the grandkids, well, that's fine. But if you're doing something like teaching future military leaders or current military leaders the lessons learned as if it was an AAR from a combat, which it should be studied in that way, and policy leaders, if they get these myths, then their decisions in the future are not going to be all that correct because they based it on fraudulent information or information that's less than accurate. So in order to use history correctly, we have to interpret it as accurately as we can, devoid of emotion and politics as much as possible. We can always reduce the bias. We can never eliminate it. And so it's in those reasons that we decided to look at and examine Sarah Paine, Professor Sarah Paine, because she is actually teaching at the Naval War College. She's a fellow over at the Hoover Institution. And so the claims that she makes or the assertions that she puts forward carry a lot of weight with a lot of people that will be making actual decisions in the future regarding national security. And the two clips that we were actually sent a few of them, but two of them really stood out, were so jarring that we said, okay, we really have to take a look at these and show the evidence and show exactly where the evidence comes from, and to say, okay, are her assertions supported by the evidence or not? And if you wanted some more about Sarah Paine, one of the books that we've read a lot of and would recommend is kind of get her view on Asia. She primarily focuses on Asia, particularly in China-Russia studies about China and Russia as Asiatic powers and then their politics and what they did in Asia. But there's a book called The Wars for Asia, 1911 to 1949. And I think I've got it here. Oop, there we go. So Wars for Asia, 1911 to 1949 by Sarah Paine. And again, it was published by Cambridge University Press. She has done a lot of work and research into it. So just some background on her. She went to China for about a year and studied in China both the Chinese language and then in their archives. However, it was during a period of CCP occupation. And so anytime you deal with a CCP, will you be really given full access to the archives? Maybe, maybe not, but most likely not from what we've seen of a lot of things. But she does go in here and she does try to stitch together kind of a longue durée about the wars in Asia and how they all kind of combined together and creating kind of a larger narrative, which is needed. And especially in the US, we haven't really looked at Asia in its own and how it kind of operates. We always tend to think of in terms of, things started at Pearl Harbor up until recently. And now we've only looked back to about 1937, but rarely do we look at, okay, the Soviet influence in what we call China, or the internal dynamics of the continent of Asia and how China kind of emerged from that and began the creation of the Chinese people, the creation of a Chinese nation starting about 1911 with the removal of the Manchus, and all of this that kind of goes into that dynamic. And then pretty much, beginning, she's in 1949, beginning of, okay, this was, World War II type of thing. But then it ends in the beginning of the Korean War, right? So there's a whole new set there. Neil Ferguson actually has another one that actually goes back a little further. He cites it from 1905 to about 1953, the end of the Korean War. And he contextualizes it more as a kind of an East meets West, and their reaction to modernity, the reaction to different types of control, colonialism and trade, and internal politics and that sort of thing. So we have a lot of these issues that need to be kind of unpacked today. But to start off, we'll go ahead and show her 2 videos, and then we'll begin commentary on it. If there's any comments, go ahead and put them in the chat box there, depending on what stream you're looking at, if it's YouTube, Rumble, Odyssey, or X, and then we'll try to answer them as best we can. We'll try to stick to the topic as much as we can. This was the prior to World War II, kind of what led Japan to World War II, and then what was the nature and the characteristic of the Japanese based upon what we call the professional reading list, right? We have a sergeant major's reading list, a command sergeant major's reading list. We have a commander's reading list and that sort of thing. Well, the Japanese had very similar. What was their professional reading? What literature were they reading, or what professional documents were they reading that kind of informed their military education? So the first one, we'll go ahead and start with we'll go with the beginning one, where she kind of makes the assertion that Herbert Hoover, and she makes the term an American first policy with the Smoot Hawley Tariff. I'm not sure that it works, but anyway, and led us to basically Pearl Harbor.
Original America First thing with a Hawley Smoot tariff, putting tariffs up to historic highs, and then everybody, of course, retaliates. So now everybody's got high tariffs. Well, here's trade-dependent Japan that's always cooperated with everybody, and suddenly they're toast. And so their solution is autarky, and they need an empire large enough to be autarkic. And so then that's when they invade Manchuria in 1931. So Chiang Kai-shek has all of a sudden lost this area from China that's greater than Germany and France combined. It's a mess. And so he's trying to balance what to do about Japanese versus communists. The Japanese don't quit with Manchuria. They stabilize the place. They make massive infrastructure developments. They transform it into the most developed part of Asia outside of the home islands, but they keep on going. And it gets so bad that the communists and the nationalists form a second united front because they're facing this lethal threat called Japan. And the Japanese react viscerally because they look at it, and the nationalists have gone over to the dark side because they've joined up with the communists. And this is when the Japanese escalate in 1937, but then they wind up stalemating. The Japanese can't stabilize the place, and the Soviets start adding more aid, and we add more aid. It's a mess. So the Japanese decide they're going to cut Western aid to the Chinese, and that's where Pearl Harbor comes in. That's what the attack of Pearl Harbor is all about, is telling Americans to stay out of Asia, which, of course, we did just the opposite.
Okay, so it sounds, it sounds fairly good. We've seen a lot of textbooks have generally that same kind of movement, not so much with the Smoot Hawley Tariff causing the invasion of Manchuria, but with this united front, because the Japanese invaded, then there was a united front between the communists and the nationalists. That caused the United States and Soviet Union to get involved. Because of that help, then Japan said, we got to get the United States out of Asia, and therefore they bombed Pearl Harbor. It's essentially what she's saying. Now, there's a number of problems with this. Now, does that hold up to the evidence? And the answer ahead of time, as we say, bottom line up front, is no. The evidence does not support her assertions. It sounds good. It's kind of interesting because, this gets a lot of play. I think now it's being shown on YouTube, and why it was sent to us is because of the current, she used the term America First, the current tariffs that are ongoing right now as American policy. She's saying, these can lead to war. One of the things about tariffs, we want to do a separate thing on tariffs and actually bring in one of the economic historians, which is actually pretty good. But I don't want to steal his thunder, but to paraphrase pretty much, what he has to say on tariffs was the America has always had tariffs. I mean, the second congressional laws that came through were basically tariffs. The first one was, okay, we're going to organize Congress and the government. The second one is how we're going to fund it, and we're going to fund it through tariffs. So, from the second act of Congress is tariffs. And then moving forward, there were always tariffs up until World War I, and they were able to fund the United States government. We had a couple of war bond drives, but essentially it was able to maintain American budgets until World War I. And then Wilson, got rid of them and instituted the income tax. And so now the American people are paying for the American government versus the American government can raise revenue and other governments have to pay for it, and other businesses and that sort of thing. And they went back in after World War I. The Smoot Hawley wasn't the first tariff. It was actually the second tariff instilled after World War I. And it was initially just basically a Farm Protection Act. But because Congress, we were already in it, there was already a run on the banks beforehand in 1929. Remember, we had the Wall Street collapse prior to the tariff being enacted. So, looking at the timeline, basically we had economic problems. Hoover wanted to help the farmers. The tariff went in. And then there was riders attached to the bill, right? So in other words, it was supposed to be just for farmers, basically on two major issues. And then there was 200 items at the end of that, including things like bottle caps that were suddenly on the tariff schedule because all of the states, because there was already economic problems in the United States, we were already in a recession, soon to be depression. A lot of the state congressmen just put riders on the bill and said, hey, we need to protect all the industry that we can in there. And Hoover, basically because of political pressure, initially, there's going to be no farmer aid, and he thought he could kind of control it afterward. He said, okay, I'll go ahead and sign the bill. But there were other things. For example, the gold standard, there were debts that were not getting paid. There was a lot of basically a bubble economy that was collapsing at that moment, because after World War I, there was a massive bubble economy that was ongoing. But yet in the middle of that, there were a tremendous amount of debts that were still occurring that needed to be paid off to the United States and to Britain. And the United States was actually giving loans to Germany to pay off their debt to Britain, and then Britain would pay off its debt to the Americans. So a lot of very interesting basically gymnastics with economy and global economy at that time. So to say that was a cause of it, Smoot Hawley, not really. Everybody was already in economic decline. Now, what was going on in Japan? Since she specifically says that Japan was seeking something called autarky and that's why when the Smoot Hawley hit and this economic collapse happened, that Japan was kind of forced because they were now seeking autarky, and they went into Manchuria. Well, Japan actually before Smoot Hawley was already in economic trouble. If you remember, in January 1927, there was the Japan banking crisis, where there was a run on the Japanese banks. And then when the 1929, the Black Thursday, basically 24th October 1929 occurred, well, that created a huge problem. Why? Because nobody was spending a lot of money on luxuries. One of Japan's major exports, and their currency wasn't convertible. Right? What that means is that they had to basically get credit by exporting items. And if they couldn't export certain things, they didn't have a good balance on their trade. Nobody was taking Japanese yen. Nobody was investing or buying in Japanese yen. Very different than today. And so what happened was that they had a banking crisis, which caused a lot of banks to actually fold. And the Bank of Japan was not going to save the other banks. So it just collapsed. A lot of banks went out of business. A lot of farmers that actually would take loans out to make expansion for planting and things like that for the next season, they were gone. Created a huge problem. So a lot of this created the social problems within Japan that you were exacerbated and kind of expressed in the 30s, because what they saw as the rich oligarchs were not affected by by bank closures, but yet the poor farmers and the poor workers were. So it created kind of a class struggle in some ways that was exacerbated because a lot of the working class, the farmer class, would go into the military. Their only option was to mostly go into the military. And so that's what occurred. And so you had a lot of these, kind of young, angry folks in the military looking at bankers that weren't affected by it while their parents are literally starving in some cases, going bankrupt and losing the farm. And so that was already in place well before Smoot Hawley. The other thing was the looking at Smoot Hawley, that wasn't done until about June 17, 1930. Now, Japan went with this word autarky. Now, America arguably was the only autarkic nation in the world. Britain relied heavily upon its colonies for much of its raw materials and some of its manufacturing. The same thing with Germany. They had to export their food or import their food. They couldn't sustain their own food. Japan was the exact opposite of almost everything that America had. America had every resource we needed within our own borders. And up until a certain time, we could sell as much as we could to everybody in America. Now, the problem was that once everybody bought something and we didn't have a huge population growth, we now needed markets, right? So we were producing more than we were buying. We needed to export. And so that was a big deal for the United States to be able to export, keep markets open. That was one of the reasons that China was so valuable to the United States, and that open door policy is because we wanted 1 billion Chinese to be Coca-Cola swilling Christians and buy our products, right? That was going to be a lifeline for the United States. If we could break into the Chinese market, that's great. We'll just keep producing because we have an advantage, because we don't have to import hardly anything to make a car, to make, you name it. There was rubber, but eventually we had synthetic rubber and we were able to do that sort of thing. So we were able to go around some of the imports we needed on rubber, but most everything else we were able to mine, to harvest right here at home. And so we had a tremendous advantage. So Japan, though, had none of those advantages. They didn't have enough coal. They didn't have enough iron, nickel, copper. They didn't have what the necessary tungsten and wolframite to harden steel. So not only could they not manufacture weapons and armaments on their own, they had to basically get imports all the time in order to basically make a car to keep a factory running. Garment factories, you name it, they needed that. And in 1929, when the Depression hit from Black Thursday, when the stock market crashed, nobody was buying luxury goods in America. One of the main exports of Japan was silk. The silkworm production was a big deal. And so what occurred was the Japanese had to look for other markets. And that happened early, though. They knew they didn't have enough material to be able to do something. And so when their cash cow, or cash worm in this case, the silkworm, went away because of nobody was buying luxury goods, or the luxury market was crashing elsewhere, they were forced into looking at where they have to retool their economy. But they had already been looking at Manchuria. In fact, it was so obvious that even in 1911, the United States Army War College, because we had these massive plans to basically War Plan Orange against Japan, and it was very detailed, the most extensive planning of any of America's war plans since World War II, even before or after. It's incredible. But one of the annexes that was always in there was the economic annex, and it realized that Japan was so reliant upon external sources for everything that it needed to be and maintain itself as a modern nation, not just a military modern nation, but a modern nation. And the Army war planners in 1911 correctly surmised that the only way that they would be able to continue as a modern nation would be to take Manchuria. Why? Because the U.S. would do the same thing in the same situation that Japan was in. They would get Manchuria. And so in 1911, it was obvious to all that Manchuria eventually was going to go into the Japanese sphere of influence. One of the side effects, or the after effects, of the Russo-Japanese War in 1905 was that Russia kind of ceded Manchuria to, once the 1911 collapse happened in China and Manchu Empire, that was going to go into the Japanese sphere of influence. And that worked up until the Tsarists fell in 1918, 1919. And then it was a big deal because the Soviet Union began to move into Mongolia. They were moving people into Manchuria. And so here's this giant communist threat on the northern end of Japan, right there where they're getting all of their materials from Manchuria. Now, they didn't own it, but they did have economic agreements. They had a railway company, which is incredibly important. In fact, synthetic fuel was made by the Japanese railroad company in Manchuria. And so they were very economically dependent upon Manchuria before they moved in and essentially made it a buffer state. So one of the things that we have to look at is, okay, when did they begin to look for autarky? And the actual date is during World War I. They realized they had to go to autarky. They, like many other nations, looked at the lessons learned of World War I, a massive industrial war, and said, hey, we've got to get autarkic if we're going to be able to keep playing this game and not become, a Stone Age colony. And so what happened was, in 1950, most of the nations in the world realized that this thing is going to become a slog. It went from, in the Western Front anyway, not the Eastern Front, but the Western Front, it went to static warfare, and it began just a grind. And it was basically industry versus industry. It was the total war concept of one nation against another, and industrial might absolutely was a determining factor in how long these people could keep slogging each other. And what I'm doing is I'm going to actually read a couple of quotes from an excellent book from the Cornell Studies in Security Affairs by Michael A. Barnhart, and it's entitled Japan Prepares for Total War, Search for Economic Security, 1919 to 1941. And this is from page 23. He gets his from a couple of different sources. One of them was Ushisabu Kobayashi, The Military Industries of Japan. That was the Oxford University Press, 1922. And others. So this is actually he's very, very well researched, uses a lot of very good source documents from all sides. And this again is from page 23, quote, Japanese staff officers in Europe submitted reports that revolutionized thinking about the nature of modern warfare. There were no neutrals. War was sure to last more than a year, perhaps far longer. Belligerents who were not self-reliant were lost. As Colonel Ugaki Kusanagi, chief of the important military affairs section of the Army Ministry, observed in Tokyo, it was no longer enough that Japan was able to construct its own warships and artillery pieces. The nation now needed to secure access to iron ore and other necessary items. The Army Ministry charged Colonel Koiso Kuniaki, a close associate of Ugaki, to analyze Japan's security problem in light of these new developments. He toured Japan, northern and central China, and translated the study of German attempts to achieve wartime autarky. His findings, which received much attention in high civilian and military circles, urged a two-pronged program for Japan. Neither the home islands nor the empire in Formosa, Korea, and South Sakhalin could provide resources sufficient for waging modern war. The control of richer territories, such as China, was imperative, end quote. And they continued this. They even dispatched a Major Suzuma Koichi to Europe, specifically to study the industrial mobilization of all the belligerents. In late 1917, he began to draft plans for Japan. So they knew a little bit later than the army did that they're going to have to go into China and Manchuria and absolutely guard that. That became imperative. They were allies with the Russians and the British and the French in the First World War. They had a treaty agreement with the British. So as long as the Russians and the British were doing okay, then Japan didn't have to worry so much, right? So because the British would keep the Russians in check. However, after the Bolshevik Revolution, now there was a huge communist threat up north, and Japan was extremely worried that Manchuria would fall. Mongolia did become a puppet state to the Soviet forces. They invaded Mongolia. They did excursions in the Xinjiang. They threatened Sakhalin. So there was a lot going on at that time that Japan was extremely concerned about. Throughout the 1920s, they were doing boards and studies. They were actually doing drills. In 1929, they had the Kansai mobilization test in February. They did a full mobilization of Kansai down to Osaka as if they were going to war. They had the military guys go in and basically kind of nationalize or notionalize the nationalization of the industry to see if they could ramp up war production to a scale that they would need and where these materials would come from. The Forced Mobilization Conference was April 1930. They did another conference a year later. And in 18 September 1931, that's when the Manchukuo incident occurred. And we see this actually occurred a little bit before. And so one of the things that's forgotten about. So yes, Japan did invade Manchuria, and it was actually the army that invaded. The government didn't have anything to do with it, but they just had to accept it as fait accompli after the army had already taken Manchuria. But what occurred before? Was it really because of Smoot Hawley Tariff? Again, no, because Smoot Hawley occurred June 17, 1930. The Manchurian incident was started a little earlier. Now, again, they invaded in 31, but what was driving that force? They knew they needed it as early as 1917. February of 1929, they were doing the Kansai mobilizations, which was, again, verifying that they could not stand on their own economically. They needed resources from Manchuria. The Soviet Union was a threat. Now, let's look at the Soviet Union, right? What was going on there? Like a good detective, you're going to take a look at the neighbors. You're going to take a look at what's going on around the incident, the crime scene itself, to say, okay, what may have contributed to that? And there's a lot of contributions here. So the USSR, as you know, had already taken over Mongolia. Mongolia was a puppet state. There were a number of border clashes between the Chinese that were in the Manchus areas and the Mongolians, the Manchus and the Russians. In fact, in 6th of August, 1929, the Soviet Union, up until that time for a few years before, had been pressuring the Manchus because it was a separate government. Remember, Manchuria was not part of China. So this idea that Chiang Kai-shek lost Manchuria is farcical, right? Manchuria was its own government. It was its own group. And so to say that was that was something that occurred is not quite true. Chiang didn't lose it. He never had it. There was some negotiation between the young marshal and the Russians. There was negotiation between the young marshal of Manchuria and the Chinese under nationalists. He also looked at different factions, Anhui and Chile, depending on the time, and he was also negotiating with the Japanese. He was trying to land the best deal for Manchuria that allowed him to maintain as much power as he possibly could. The Russians were basically seeding folks into their version of the Manchurian Railway Company, which they still had railway lines in Manchuria. They were feeding information. They were feeding their own people in there. They were seeding it with revolutionaries. And the Chinese basically said, or the Manchus said, no, we're not going to do this anymore. The elder marshal started to go to Japan and say, look, we're going to do a deal with you, but we want you to protect us against the Russians, the Soviets. In 6th of August, 1929, the Soviet Union mobilizes and issues threats, and it begins to expel ethnic Chinese and Manchurians from the Soviet sphere. In 17th of August, 1929, the Soviet Union invades Manchuria. This is the part that is always left out. This is the part that is omitted in almost every narrative about one contributing factor, a major contributing factor of why the Japanese Kwangtung Army that was based in Korea felt it had to go into Manchuria. Why? Because in August of 1929, the Soviet Union invaded it and basically placed it now on a border right there with a Japanese province, which at that time was Korea. And so and all of the Japanese materials, their factories, they had oil, they were doing synthetic oil, they had massive resources coming out of there. If the Soviet Union took over Manchuria, Japan was dead in the water. They would have to go somewhere else, and it was a little too late for that because their plans had been, we got to get Manchuria. So essentially, when the Soviet Union pulled back out later, a few months later, and ceded the area with revolutionaries, there is some evidence to say from the Soviet archives that basically they're the ones that killed the elder marshal and framed it on Japan, trying to get the young marshal to go on their side. Again, and interestingly, it was the same assassin that killed Trotsky in Mexico City. So the Soviets had a pretty good, effective assassin there. So he was operating in Manchuria, and then he ended up going down to Mexico to take care of all the political enemies. I tend to think that it was the Russians, because if you look at the dynamic, what they were trying to leverage, it makes sense. But they didn't want to trigger any type of international sanction or international war. So they did it as they normally did. They would kind of do these covert clandestines prior to setting up the political environment, and then they would move in. And so they had already moved in kinetically. They were still trying to leverage it so that the Manchus would ask them to come in. And that was the assassination of the elder marshal, who was the Manchurian leader. And then the young marshal, his son, was next in line. And at that point, who knows which way he was going to go, but he definitely was believing that to some degree that the Japanese had killed his father. The international press was doing that. But now we know from the records in the Soviet archives, it was most likely a Soviet agent that did it and then kind of framed Japan for the assassination. Whichever way it is, the Japanese saw that this was a threat and they needed to move in there. It was becoming destabilized. If the Manchus went to either the Kuomintang or to the Soviets, it was almost the same, because the Soviets at the same time were infiltrating the Kuomintang. So this is why one of the reasons that Chiang Kai-shek became so anti-communist is because he recognized that the communists were going to infiltrate and take over the nationalist movement within China and co-opt it and make it basically a puppet state. Red colonialism is what he called it. And he knew the threat from the communists, and he knew that the CCP, especially with Mao, they would go whichever way that the power was going to give them. If the Japanese were ascendant, Mao was going to be with the Japanese. If the Soviets were ascendant, Mao was going to be with Stalin. They would go whichever way that the power was going to give him. Mao just wanted to be basically the new emperor of China. So he was willing to do anything. But Chiang Kai-shek of the Kuomintang recognized the threat from the Soviets. And so at the same time, though, the Japan assessed that the Kuomintang had been infiltrated by the Soviets, and that was a problem. So the Russians had influence within the Kuomintang, and if Manchuria went there, it was just too much. So the army decided, okay, we're going to go forward and we're going to go and take it over. And they did. And it was very rapid. It was very quick. And in short order, they had Manchuria, and the Tokyo government was not able to effectively control the army unit. And it was a fait accompli. They kind of accepted the fact, but it created tremendous political divisions within, because on the one hand, they knew, okay, we do need it for basic survival, going forward to maintain an industrial base here in Japan, but it doesn't look good. And so that was the issue that Japan was fighting. And they continued this kind of political back and forth. Now, keep in mind, in Japan, there was something like 18 prime ministers between the economic crisis of the Japan banking crisis in 1927 and the beginning of World War II. So in the space of about 14 years, they had 18 prime ministers. That's almost one prime minister a year, right? It was almost one cabinet every year and a half. There was no continuity within the Japanese government. It was absolutely chaos. So for them to be able to form up a solid government, central government, to say, okay, we're gonna hold the army in check, or we're gonna hold these guys in check, it doesn't understand the dynamics that was going on within Japan at that time. It was extremely chaotic. It was extremely divided. It wasn't this monolith that we kind of imagine it to be. And along those lines, continuing on with one of Sarah Paine's accusations in there, that led to Pearl Harbor. Well, no, it didn't, because what happened was she said it was so bad, and she uses this term, it was so bad because of this invasion of Manchuria. It was so bad that it drove Chiang and Mao together. Well, that's not true. What drove Chiang and Mao together was, again, Stalin. So the Russians were all up in China. People don't realize that they shared a land border with it, much like America is very involved in Mexico and South America. The Russians were very involved. That was their sphere in China. They had a puppet state set up in Mongolia, and they were working at hitting the periphery there in Xinjiang, and they were kind of eyeballing Manchuria for a while. They had invaded in 1929, pulled back out after ceding it for the revolution. And so they were very much involved in all of the politics. And so, like I said, they had pressured the Manchus, and then what they did was they would give support alternately between Chiang Kai-shek and Mao. They knew Mao was not the leader for the Red Chinese. As much as this kind of myth of who Mao was, he wasn't. Mao was just a political opportunist. Stalin knew that, right? And Mao had no problem giving up his own biological son to be a hostage in Moscow, and there we had no problem on that. The files in Moscow on Mao are very revealing about what the Soviets thought Mao was. He was an opportunist. He was basically an intellectual criminal, but he was useful, right? As long as he could get something done, as long as you lit enough fires under him to get something, done. So what happened was that actually there was a group within China that was looking at basically trying to get the Chinese to unite, but it was to the advantage of the communists, right? It was the advantage of the CCP, because Chiang Kai-shek, his policy was once he kind of moves out takes over the Chile faction, the Anhui faction, he gets rid of some of the other competing warlords, and then he's going to go and he's going to deal with the communists, and then he can deal with the foreigners, which is not just Japan. There are other foreigners there with extraterritoriality, but he has to do it one step at a time. And so he recognized that this was the best strategy to be able to maintain China. And in the end, it turned out that he was right. However, the communists wanted to basically create what they called a united front, but then they're going to sit on the sidelines, let the Kuomintang bleed out fighting the Japanese. And as Mao knew, well, if the Japanese beat the Kuomintang, then because Mao had been working with a Japanese intelligence colonel, then he could be set up like a Wittgen Quisling and maybe rule China, kind of like Wang Xingwei was later on. Or if the Kuomintang are absolutely wiped out, Japan doesn't move in, well, then he can step into the void created by the Kuomintang falling. That was basically what they were looking at. So when a treasonous general kidnapped Chiang Kai-shek and demanded that he would do that, initially Mao was going to kill Chiang Kai-shek. It wasn't a unified front. It was just a move for power. And so what happened was the Soviets, the Soviet Union, and this information comes mostly from the Soviet archives, that a lot of this movement was basically to tell Mao, don't you dare kill him, make this united front, let's do this, and then go against the Japanese. Why? Because the Japanese had taken over Manchuria, and the Soviets were now afraid that they were going to move into the east, and they were going to start being able to get in the Soviet sphere of influence. And if there's a powerful Manchuria, it was an antidote to a lot of the communist agitation. If they could make Manchuria economically viable, then you don't need a Soviet revolution for that, right? So they wanted to say the only way to modernize China was through communism, not through the Japanism or the Japanese methods. And so it was that ideological battle that occurred. They wanted this Manchurian effort to fail. The other thing that Paine was wrong on is that she says that they stabilized and they built all these heavy industries in Manchuria. That again is not true. By 1937-38, they recognized that the 5-year plan, I think it was Ugeki, actually looked at the 5-year plan and said, no, this isn't working, right? In other words, Manchuria did not have the resources. They were spending too much money. And when 1927, when the bank crisis hit, now they have to build up their domestic economy. They don't have enough money to be able to invest to build the factories, the mines, the oil rigs, the water wells, the infrastructure, the railroads, the highways, the telegraph lines, everything that you need to get this industry going. They didn't have that type of investment. Because remember, they have to export. Everything has to be exported. So a lot of the resources that were coming in there were getting exported. The biggest thing they had a problem with was machine tools. They couldn't get machine tools to buy it. All of their machine tools came from, guess where? America. A lot of the exports went to where? America. So America was probably the biggest trading partner of Manchukuo, the Japanese-occupied Manchukuo, than anything. And so when eventually war hits, that's one of the reasons Japan was very hesitant to fight America, because it was so economically entangled with America. That's why it's the myth of the trading partners will never go to war. Yeah, they have, right? In Japan and America, for one. So the Manchuria as being able to modernize as much as the Japanese wanted to get that autarky is not true. They had not stabilized Manchuria by any means yet. It was still very dependent upon American investment and American purchases, and most importantly, American machine tools to come in there, because the Japanese could not manufacture machine tools yet on their own. They hadn't set those factories up by 1937-38, and then war breaks out, and now they have a problem, right? So all of the big military leaders that were in Manchuria, for example, did not want to have a war because they said, look, I need another 5 years to be able to get this economy till we can even have anything. To give you an example of how bankrupt the Japanese military was, even at this time, there was about 100 border wars before Namonhan. Everybody talks Namonhan, Khalkhin Gol, the battle between Japan and the Soviet Union over in the border of Manchuria and Mongolia, right? And there was a number of battles before that occurred, and the Japanese could not even field anti-tank ordnance, right? So an anti-tank round, like a Hesh round or a HEP round, they couldn't field those. They couldn't manufacture those and get them forward. And what do the Soviets use a lot of? Tanks, right? So what do you need? Anti-tank armor or anti-tank ordnance. What do the Japanese not have? Anti-tank ordnance. So when the Battle of Namonhan hit, it just didn't have enough ordnance to be able to go forward at that moment. That's even before Pearl Harbor, right? So in other words, they're going up against an industrial power. Doesn't work. Against basically militia forces that they were hitting in China, which is the majority was like militia forces or infantry units with very little supported of almost no tanks in China, even in the Kuomintang. It worked. The Japanese table of organization was able to conduct those battles. They were not able to conduct it against highly motorized mechanized army. Nevertheless, this is another turn as Zhukov actually was in his notes. He realized that it was pretty bloody, right? Even though they were outclassed, the Soviets were kind of glad that the Japanese sued for peace at that moment because they were getting bloodied pretty bad in the Namonhan. So they gave good account for themselves, but they just didn't have the ability to be able to do a full modern industrial warfare. So looking forward, what happened was again, the Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek was kidnapped. Mao was going to kill him. Moscow said, don't you dare, we'll kill you. He said, okay, fine. And then they did the United Front. But then it was basically the Kuomintang had to go forward and fight. But even then, Chiang Kai-shek didn't want to. And so when the Marco Polo Bridge incident happened and northern China, there was a skirmish, the Second Sino-Japanese War in January of 1937. Remember the kidnapping in January occurred in 1936, January 1937. Moscow basically told Mao exactly what to do next. The CCP was going to abandon its policy of trying to overthrow the government, right? Stop confiscating land, stop robbing the rich, stop doing your proletariat revolution, right? And you need to go and just basically unify all the people and keep the Japanese tied down in China so we can mobilize. Because at that point, they were already into another 5-year plan where they needed to mobilize, right? So there was an arms race going on between Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, which started, actually the Soviet Union started it before Hitler even came in. He started in 1931, 1932 with his first 5-year plan. The Russians were already doing that, but the Russians needed to make sure that the Japanese, now that were up on the border, that they weren't going to be able to go up into the Soviet Union. And so they needed the Japanese tied down, and they needed Mao to use the Kuomintang to make sure that the Japanese are tied down in there. They don't modernize and industrialize Manchuria, and that gives the Soviet Union breathing room. And so that's what that strategy was. It wasn't so bad that it pushed those two together. And even then, the Kuomintang, the Chiang Kai-shek, was looking for an option to be able to negotiate with the Japanese. He still wasn't 100% that he's going up against the Japanese because he recognized, rightfully so, that the communists, the CCP and Russia, the red colonialists up to the north, were ready to take over China. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. Now, what happened was in 1937, this is actually going off a little bit, but everybody points to Shanghai starting up, and they say the Japanese did it. Well, the problem was there was a general who was basically a communist general on the Kuomintang side, and he was Zhang Zhizhong. Funny name, right? Zhang Zhizhong. He was commander of the Shanghai Nanjing garrison, right? And 1925, he was a teacher over at Whampoa, which is the Russian-funded and Russian-staffed military academy named Canton. Let's remember that. 1925, there was a Russian military academy near Canton called the Whampoa Academy, where a lot of them went. So a lot of the folks that went through there were indoctrinated as communists. And in his own memoirs, the General Zhang Zhizhong said, in the summer of 25, and I'm quoting, in the summer of 1925, I was completely in sympathy with the Communist Party and was called a Red Teacher, Red Regiment Commander. I wanted to join the CCP, and I told Mr. Zhao Enlai, right? Zhao told him, end quote, Zhao told him to stay with the Nationalists and collaborate covertly with the CCP. So he was a sleeper agent, right? And right when the Marco Polo Bridge incident happened, General Zhang was down in operating the Shanghai Nanjing garrisons, right? So all those groups down there, including the 88th and the 100th Division, which was the Nazi trained division of the Chinese Kuomintang. And he was ready to go to war with Japanese in there. Chiang Kai-shek said no, 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 and then the negotiation. They negotiated the northern. They had a ceasefire settlement. The northern skirmish area where the Japanese were fighting the Kuomintang, that was calmed down. It was already going to happen. It's going to go over. However, Zhang exacerbated the incidents in Shanghai and started the war, and Chiang Kai-shek was mad, and that's what started it. And then the Japanese moved, as you know, took over Shanghai. There was a battle in Shanghai. It was a defensive battle because Zhang threw the 100th and the 88th Division into Shanghai, a garrison, was small international garrison of naval landing forces that was there from the Japanese that guarded the international settlement. As we had our Marines there, we had the 4th Marines there. The French had their units there. The British had their military units there. So they've been there for a long time. Back in the Boxer Rebellion, that's what they used, and you had to keep them there. The Kuomintang attacked. The Japanese were surrounded, and kind of like what MacArthur did in Korea, there was an amphibious assault around the flanks. Well, the Japanese did this amphibious assault around the flanks of the Chinese, a very classic amphibious assault. It was amazing. Turn the flank and then force the Chinese Kuomintang all the way back into Nanking. And the Japanese followed that retreating army all the way back into Nanking. And then the group, the Chinese Kuomintang, had to leave Nanking, actually pulled up. That was the capital, right? So they actually, the Japanese marched to the capital and then took over the capital, and forcing the Kuomintang to go to fall back, basically. And so, but that started because the Kuomintang wanted to do that. They had to bog down the Japanese within there. It was so bad that this occurred. That all that occurred beforehand. And again, Moscow was kind of dictating that. So we have to again look at this, and those dynamics were set up at the end of, pretty much we're beginning at the end of World War I, had solidified somewhat in the 1920s, and then were exacerbated, played out in the 1930s. Not because of Smoot Hawley, not because of some America First thing. It's ridiculous. But let's move forward. Her next thing was that we were supporting the Kuomintang. Russians were now supporting. Well, the Russians had been supporting, right? So in 1925, they were already supporting. The Japanese knew they were supporting in there. That was not something hidden. The Japanese knew also a little bit more than the Americans did that Chiang Kai-shek wanted to get rid of the communists first, and they were willing to kind of do a deal with them, but not if he's going to be at the behest of a foreign power. They wanted Chiang Kai-shek to be there because the Japanese basically were, at this point, after Versailles, recognizing that, okay, unless we get a lot more Asians together, we're just going to get stepped on. Because at Versailles, most people forget, 1919, after World War I, the Japanese were on the victorious Entente side, and they were sitting at the Paris Peace Conference. They were sitting at the Versailles Peace Conference. They were working toward the League of Nations charters, and they said, let's put in a clause that says equality of all races and equality of all religions. And the U.S. absolutely shot that down and led France and Britain to go, no, right? There's no way. And so that went away, despite Wilson's, despite Wilson's proclivities for saying, oh, it's self-determination of peoples. Well, it should go into there that all peoples are equal based on race and all people are equal based on religion. There's no primacy. But that got shot down. So very quickly, Japan realized that this was the League of Nations, and that the Versailles Treaty was more of a control mechanism than a true kind of egalitarian, way to do things. And so it wasn't really a problem later when they kind of walked out because of Manchuria. But we made a big deal about it. But, look what the U.S. wants to do now. That the UN has kind of turned against the United States. It's a mechanism for kind of a control system. It devolved into that, despite some of the intentions that the people that were setting it up or, were staffing it in the beginning. It turned into essentially a control mechanism. The Rif War, where the French and the Spanish and the Italians went and destroyed self-determination among people in North Africa. And that wasn't looked on negatively, but Japan doing similar in Manchuria, well, that was bad. So the double standard was apparent and was noted. So going forward from this, the help was already there. Yes, the U.S. was sending in material help illegally with Camco and other aviation kind of front companies to support the Kuomintang. Yes, the Soviets were supporting, but also so were the Italians. The Germans had been supporting the Kuomintang up until the point, and this is interesting. So the Germans were actually massively supporting, the Nazis were actually massively supporting the Kuomintang. And so that's why you'll see some of the pictures of the Kuomintang, the Chinese army, have these little, German helmets on. Well, that's because, the Germans were there giving advisor. Falkenhayn was the first one, and he pretty much set the model. And the 88th and the 100th Division are from that, and that was kind of a modern assault division that they were using. And that changed. Now, why did that change? Once the Japanese got Shanghai, they got a lot more of the coastal areas and Hainan Island, and they moved forward and they grabbed Nanking. They had outlets, right? So China had very little room to maneuver to export. They could go to Hong Kong, but that's about it, right? Or they go overland to Russia, but that's about it. So the traditional ports now are in Japanese hands. Well, what was needed from China to Germany, right? Remember, Germany needed materials, it wasn't autarkic. It needed tungsten and wolframite, and it got a lot of its tungsten and wolframite from the China mines. So economically, that kind of made Germany say, well, we may have to do deals with the Japanese, and they were more receptive to Japanese approaches because tungsten and wolframite. Now the Japanese are sitting on it, and if you wanted to get some, you had to deal with the Japanese. What the Japanese weren't going to use themselves, and they didn't produce as much munitions as Germany was doing at that point, and what Krupp had designs for, the Krupp factory. So they were getting a lot of that, and they needed to get in line to get the top billing to be able to buy those materials. So that shaped some of the political maneuvers after that. But it was purely an economic decision, because there were a lot of folks that were in the German mission in China that wanted to continue to support Chiang Kai-shek, and they didn't want to support the Japanese at all. And it came down to economics. Who's got the wolframite and tungsten? But most of the inertia was for the Nazis supporting the Kuomintang. But the Japanese didn't bomb Berlin, right? they didn't bomb anything like that. So it wasn't a matter of that sort of thing. The other part was the Japanese were okay with moving out of China. They didn't want to take China. They wanted China securely as an ally, right? They wanted China securely not in the column of the communists. They didn't want that potential there. They wanted China not to be behest to others, right? And they also said, look, the open door is actually the U.S. is just stepping on us all over the place, right? Because we can't produce. They wanted to be able to get a leg up industrially in that zone and that sort of thing. They also recognized that, the U.S. has a Monroe Doctrine in Central and somewhat South America. Why can't we have it over here, right? So again, it was that double standard. But going through, if you look at this, and this is from the memoirs of Prince Konoye. Now, remember, there was about 18 prime ministers that were there, but the one that was there the longest, he was there 2 terms, and he was there during some critical times in the late 30s, and then just before Tojo was prime minister, just before Pearl Harbor. So that final negotiation with America, it was Prince Konoye. And Prince Konoye was about as liberal as you can get. He was foreign educated at the Ivy Leagues. He was, extremely, the Western. He still believed in the Western liberal system, and he wanted to negotiate. Now, if you look at his points of understanding, so they were negotiating all through the summer of late 1940, the summer of 1941. It was established that they wanted to do that, and within it, it said that they were okay with being able to negotiate a peace with China and to withdraw from China as long as Manchuria is recognized by the United States. That was it. So the United States was presented from Japan that China would be able to be left alone. China would be independent. There would be no reparations. I'll read it actually. This is from page 41 of the Translations of Memoirs by Prince Konoye, The Secret Negotiations between Japan and the U.S. before Pearl Harbor. It's actually done by the Pacific Atrocities Education Group with Jenny Chan and Barbara Halperin. No friends of Japan, so the translation will be, has not been altered to a friendly way. But nevertheless, through that, you will see that it blows away some of this myth. So the relations of the two governments concerning the China affair, the American president recognizes the following conditions, and moreover, if the Japanese government guarantees them, the American president shall advise peace to the Shang regime on the basis of China's independence, withdrawal of Japanese troops from China territory based on mutual agreement to be entered by Japan and China, non-annexation of China, non-reparations, restoration of the open door policy, the amalgamation of Chinese regime and the Wang government, because there was a Wang Shengwei who had a separate Kuomintang, the self-restraint of large-scale collective immigration of Japanese to Chinese territory, and recognition of Manchukuo. So America said, we'll recognize Manchukuo, but you got to get out. Don't take reparations from China, et cetera, et cetera. So if the Chiang regime responds to the American president's advice, the Japanese government shall immediately open peace negotiations directly with the Chinese government to consider being newly unified or the demands to compose the Chinese government. So, and there's some other things in there with naval air strength, doing economic activities in the Southwest Pacific area, et cetera, et cetera. So this went back and forth, and the Japanese said, okay. And this was they said, we'll do it, but we have to ensure that we get some materials in there. And then the talks basically broke down. But the point about China was already in there. The Japanese were willing to kind of move out of China as long as their economic line was there, and as long as it was ensured that the communists wouldn't go in there. And the problem broke down on that issue, and there were some nuances there in how the Japanese saw it. And then there was a missing telegram that never made it to the U.S. And then again, talks broke down, and that kind of led to Pearl Harbor. It wasn't the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor to get America out. They were bombing it because of an economic blockade. Remember, Japan was not autarkic. They were trying to get autarkic there. They couldn't because now they've got a war, so they were never able to build up Manchuria to its industrial base. The government of Japan is negotiating like crazy. They wanted to meet President Roosevelt in Hawaii. President Roosevelt said no. They said, okay, we'll go to Alaska. President Roosevelt didn't respond. So, it wasn't, they were desperate to negotiate because they needed fuel. Why? Because there's another great book here with great source documents. It's Edward S. Miller, Bankrupting the Enemy, the U.S. Financial Siege of Japan Before Pearl Harbor. And we did. Mostly people will say, well, we just blockaded the oil because of what they did in China. Well, since War Plan Orange, we knew since 1906 that we would lead to economic eventual impoverishment and exhaustion. And that was in our war plans in 1911. And in the end, economic ruin that was built into our war plan in 1920. So, and then even as War Plan Orange evolved into Rainbow 5, which was against Germany and Japan, the economic destruction of Japan was always in there. And we began those beforehand. It wasn't just oil. It was looking at their gold reserves, because remember, it's not a convertible currency. Their gold reserves elsewhere, they're held elsewhere. Those are seizable assets, and then they're in trouble, right? So they are really, really, really in trouble because they're buying things with gold reserves that they have in our banks. And that they were looking for all of the assets that they could seize of Japan, to include silk. They were looking at scrap metal, a lot of the petroleum byproducts. They were looking at ball bearings. They were looking at everything. And they were slowly squeezing Japan and reducing their credit. They even had a mission fly into Indonesia. Once the Dutch had been taken over by the Nazis, Indonesia was kind of in a nebulous point. The Japanese were going down there and saying, hey, we'll buy all the Indonesian oil, which is owned by the Dutch. And the Americans went down there and bought it all up. So there was nothing left to sell to the Japanese, right? So in other words, and this is before the war. So the Japanese Pearl Harbor was absolutely to knock out the Americans for a period of time, just long enough, a delaying action, so that they could grab the oil and some of the resources like rubber and tin that was down in Southeast Asia with it's interesting because they invaded Indonesia, which was Dutch, which was under the Nazi rule, and then they invaded Malaysia and Burma, which was under British rule. So they're fighting interesting things there. And then they were kind of taking over the Vichy French area in Vietnam. So it was kind of a mismatch of what they were fighting and their enemies were. But the main thing was essentially to get resources. That's what they needed. And that's why it went to Pearl Harbor. It didn't have anything to do with Smoot Hawley. It had everything to do with that period of progression of events combining together and failed negotiations that said, okay, well, we have to go to war. Otherwise, we're just going to starve. Right. And at that point, it was a big deal for them. And it had been for a long time. And they knew this since World War I, as many other nations knew that thing. So her assertion on that, did the facts support the evidence? Answer, no. All right. So we're going to take a little quick break here. And then we're going to come back and we're going to study about the Hagakure. And according to Professor Paine, she says that this book, this obscure book that was written in a prefecture, was the reason that the Japanese would banzai charge and go crazy everywhere. And they absolutely lost their minds on the strategic and the operational level and thought only in tactics because of this book. But we'll take a quick break right now. I got to go get a drink, and then we'll return and go over that. So about 2 minutes and we'll be back.
Investigated. Welcome to the Historical Detective Agency, your stop for journeying back in time to examine history as an investigator would. The past
All right.
investigated.
Aha.
Welcome to the
One more
historical...
time, because we didn't hear it enough the first time. Okay, so we're back on the Sarah Paine examination. So we've looked at her initial assertion, which was, there was some kind of America First policy with Herbert Hoover, and that led to Pearl Harbor. As we see, not even close, right? There's a number of other factors in there. It also removes agency from, entire nations like, the Russians, the Soviet Union, which was expansionistic and militaristic at that period of time, that was very involved in the Chinese affairs. And she should know better because she was basically in China and Russia. That was her focus, is China and Russia, learning the languages, looking at those archives. So to remove that narrative about even Russia invading Manchuria in 1929 as one of the deciding factors for the Japanese generals to move in there because it was destabilizing, well, I don't know. And it's okay, like I said, if you're teaching a bunch of grandmothers at a patriotic day and that you want to make a point, okay, if you're at the the anti-Trump anti-tariff, anti-Trump rally, okay, well, if you need some kind of story to rally the troops, that's fine. If we're at war against Japan and we need this kind of propaganda, okay, maybe we could use that. But she's sitting there at the Naval War Academy. We're not at war with Japan. Japan's an ally. We are essentially at a proxy war with both Russia and China, and she puts this kind of stuff out there. It's dangerous, right? At the very least, it's very dangerous because those young cadets there, when they come on and they go out and they become ensigns and lieutenants and captains, and they move up, if that's the basis of their understanding, they are not going to be able to make those complex decisions about what is the geopolitical sphere in there. They will not be able to make another detailed policy like War Plan Orange that could anticipate. They can effectively look at the world as it is, looking at the patterns of history and say, okay, this is what's going to happen there, right? So remember, it was Army War College guys, majors, colonels that were in 1911 that said, hey, Japan's going to have to go into Manchuria. Why? Because that's what we'll do. That's just the basics of it, right? It's nothing special. It's nothing different. There's not one nation that's more evil than others. All have vested interest that they will go for. Everyone and every nation acts in its own self-interest at different times based on the conditions that are there. And that's the same if you're an investigator, a private investigator, police investigator, or historical investigator. Understanding that every human being, every country has capacity for great good. Every human being, every country has capacity for great evil. Everyone, every country will at certain times and certain conditions act in their own best interest. In fact, mostly they act in their own best interest. Now, it could be an emotional thing that, it doesn't make sense physically, but emotionally they feel good, or politically, internally, that's where they're doing it. But essentially, they're going to act in their own interest. And so to sit there and try to connect this in some way to Smoot Hawley and Hoover, not really. It makes sense. Look at it. They're going to operate in a certain way. So give those young future leaders in the Navy a fighting chance and start teaching them something that's accurate, not this. Now, what's next? So I'll play this part here with Sarah Paine, and we'll see if it holds up to examination.
Japanese were ordered to hold a position. We had to kill 495. Last 5 committed suicide before we could take the place. And it was this combination of obedience and ferocity that made the Japanese so formidable.
All right, I'm going to try that again.
Another value that's emphasized in Bushido, willpower. The way of the samurais in desperateness, simply become insane and desperate, and it'll somehow work out for you.
I'm going to blame the Chinese for jamming this. Hang on just a second. Let's see if we can get this up and a little bit better. If not, I'll just have to paraphrase it.
One could accomplish any feat. Think of Pearl Harbor. And if 500 Japanese were ordered to hold a position, we had to kill 495. Last 5 committed suicide before we could take the place. And it was this combination of obedience and ferocity that made the Japanese so formidable. formidable. This brings me to another value that's emphasized in Bushido: willpower. The way of the samurai is in desperateness. Simply become insane and desperate, and it'll somehow work out for you. One can accomplish any feat. Think of Pearl Harbor. And this emphasis on willpower and just trying harder, it denigrates strategy. And here you see a picture of the supreme example of honor and loyalty and willpower in the kamikaze pilots. And here Yamamoto's me talking about tactics, but it has operational and strategic implications. He says learning such things as military tactics is useless. The way of the samurai is one of immediacy, and it is best to dash in headlong. So much for my job at the Naval War College. So much for the case studies. There's a lack of grand strategy. What's grand strategy? It's integrating all the instruments of national power, not just the army or the army and the navy, which is what the Japanese are trying to do. If the bigger aim is to stabilize China and keep the communists out, there ought to be some diplomacy and some other things going on.
All right, we'll blame the CCP for jamming this one. So anyway, video was very, very torn up. But if you can, just go on YouTube, you'll look it up. Just look up Sarah Paine, Hagakure. But what she was trying to say was that she takes a quote by, basically says, you have to kill all the Japanese, and that sort of thing. And in some theaters, that was true. In the Pacific theater, it was very bloody. It was very no holds barred, no quarter given. However, the Japanese, depending upon the theater, would surrender, and they would surrender in mass, and they were very compliant prisoners. The United States, if you look at the intel, a lot of the OSS and the OWI, they would have to get commanders to bribe some of the Marines to take prisoners. The Americans just wouldn't, no quarter given. A lot of it was the Japanese knew they're going to get killed, right? In other words, they're just going to get killed if they get captured. And, what's the use, right? So if we're going up against Al Qaeda, the same thing happened, right? There's a couple of videos of, prisoners getting their heads cut off, and that deters a lot of surrender to the enemy, right? In other words, that's one of the factors. The other factor is since time immemorial, since since basically Roman times, actually Greek times, but mostly the Romans, they understood that if you, Scipio Africanus, if you encircled an enemy and provide him no way out, he will fight to the last man. You always have to provide the enemy a way out so that they can retreat. You provide them that retreat, and then they can go, right? So if your goal is to get them to surrender, we'll provide them a way out, and then they'll surrender. And the Japanese did, if given A, a way out, and B, they thought that they weren't going to get slaughtered. They didn't do a lot of surrendering in China because a lot of the Chinese, the guerrillas would kill them. But when the Kuomintang was actually doing a campaign, I believe in 1938, 39, they were taking prisoners. The Japanese actually were surrendering. There was a lot of good intelligence that was coming out from those prisoners that were coming through. And if the Japanese themselves, the POWs, were used to get the Japanese to surrender, because a lot of it was language barriers, they were able to convince and coax a lot of people out. So using the Japanese to get the Japanese to surrender was a successful policy. Now, she says that this was due. So we do have stories. There's a lot of stories in the Pacific of Marines, the firsthand accounts, that it was very brutal, that they would fight to the end. And a lot of times they would. But again, remember the Americans, the Japanese remember the American, not just in the beginning of the war, not just during the island campaign when a lot of the Marines were just not taking prisoners, or they would kill prisoners. But they remember also in the Philippines during the revolutions, the various revolutions in the Philippines, that the Americans would wipe out entire villages. Leonard Wood, who later became General Leonard Wood, now Fort Leonard Wood, when he was in the Philippines, he was responsible actually for a campaign that pretty much made My Lai look like nothing. In other words, they would wipe out an entire village of the Moro, women, children, men. They just would blast the heck out of it with artillery and just clear through, right? No quarter given, no nothing, no prisoners. And so And that was in the American papers. That was, they actually were trying to do courts on that. So America had a lot of soul searching to do. That was our first Vietnam, was actually the Philippine insurrection that occurred after the Americans took the Philippines in the Spanish-American War. And it created a big problem for America, but it was known. And the Japanese press knew that too. And so the style of American fighting to the Japanese perspective was very much as we viewed the Japanese, right? We both viewed each other as these, creatures that are just not going to take prisoners, right? That's just not what's going to happen. And so it's not due to a book. Well, I take it back. Let's look at the book, right? Let's look at the evidence, because that's what this is about. Let's examine it. Let's reduce our bias, because we've already biased ourselves a little bit against Sarah Paine because of her first video, which was completely false. So the second one, she's claiming, and again, that was a bad video. She's claiming that this book was critical in convincing the Japanese that, therefore, don't use tactics, just rush headlong in there. And what that's doing is that's appealing to kind of a collective memory of banzai charges and that sort of thing. Did the banzai charge occur? Yeah. But if you're the only people on an island, there's no way off of there. And in your mind, the Americans, and to some degree, rightfully so, the Americans are going to kill you, right? Even if you surrender, they're just not going to take prisoners. What are you going to do? Well, nothing to do, banzai, right? In other words, and we do the same thing. In other words, was there a Hagakure when we stood at the Alamo? Was there a Hagakure when we made last stands, throughout campaigns and histories and wars? Was there a Hagakure? Was there a Hagakure in the Civil War? At Pickett's Charge, did they read the Hagakure and Pickett's Charge and just absolutely go up, against cannon and against, tremendously vast fire, both musket and rifle fire against you? Did they read the Hagakure? No. This is a common human condition. This goes back to what I said at the beginning of the introduction, that a lot of people do not understand that human beings are much the same, and human group behavior, especially during combat, is much the same, right? And if you understand the human nature, group dynamics, human social interactions, if you understand that interaction, how it breaks down and forms up under different lines during the stresses of combat and different types of combat, the cohesion, commitment, and confidence of a unit and how it responds to the battle will follow along similar lines, irrespective of cultures, right? In other words, they will operate much the same. And the problem is that we have this kind of mythology that we put around the Japanese that accounts for that. In fact, we'll go over a couple things here to demonstrate that. And we'll go back again to some of the source documents. One of those, before we talk about that, let's talk about what were the Japanese reading. So she makes reference to the Hagakure. What's that? The Hagakure was actually a 9-volume book that was written during the Tokugawa period. So about 200 years, 150 years before World War II, 200 years before World War II, it was written, and it was written by a retired samurai. Now, the samurai during the Tokugawa period were not warriors. They hadn't fought a war. They were bureaucrats. They were essentially bureaucrats. They would do things like accounting. They would do things like waterworks. There was guys in charge of fortifications. There were samurai in charge of roads. They were bureaucrats, right? They just carried swords and they had certain status, but that was it. And so many of them pined for the martial way. Now, they kept the martial way. They kept an internal code. The term Bushido had not been in popular use. That was Inazu Nitobe later on in the turn of the century, for the 18th and 19th century, defining what Japan was and what was this kind of this behavioral code of the bureaucratic class, the military bureaucratic class that ran Japan during the Tokugawa period, was Bushido, but it wasn't martial. And so the first 2 volumes of this 9-volume, the Hagakure, were pining for the good old days, not something he had experienced, the author had experienced, but something pining. He had heard about the good old days, and we're weak and we're soft, and we need to get back to this. So that's what he's doing. He's pining for an imaginary, knighthood, much as we would look at the Knights of the Round Table and Camelot and say that we need to be like those knights again. But that's not informing our general officer class. That's not what the sergeant majors are looking at when they do what they're doing. That's not what an admiral's looking at. It's in no way is that sort of thing. It may inspire some of the soldiers and think, oh, I'm going to do this. But at the end of the day, you're going to go what your training does. You're going to go what you're indoctrinated to do, and what that social organization, the organizational structure of the military, was set up to fight, right? And where you're put, what equipment you've got, what training you have, and for your unit, confidence, cohesion, and commitment. Those are what plays, not some obscure book that, may have been fashionable, right? There's no, we're not looking at some, Clive Cussler book or, a Harry Potter book, and that's now informing our policy, right? It's popular, people read it, but it's not something that's going to inform our policy. What was the professional reading of the Japanese military? And we'll get to that actually right now. So there were imperial rescripts, and imperial rescripts come from the emperor. So they carry a lot of weight, right? So the emperor was the end all be all. At that point, that was the authority, right? So if something came from the emperor, if it had the emperor's seal, you're inculcated since childhood to respect it and to listen to it. And it starts, as I said, and speaking of children, this is the imperial rescript. I'm going to put this up here. If you have video, if it's not on the audio podcast, if you're looking on the video on YouTube, X, or Rumble or Odyssey, you'll see it up there. That's the imperial rescript to children for education. And these were both the imperial rescripts for education and for the military were done by folks who were steeped in both the Western and the Eastern philosophical traditions. And so it wasn't something that came exclusively from a samurai class. It came from many Western thinkers and moved with things, even the mainland Asian thinkers like Confucius, and some Buddhist thought was in there. And then they infused some of their own in there. Now, what does this say? It's interesting because a lot of people will look at this and it was banned after World War II. In fact, there's a lot of controversy now because there's a couple of school programs that want to continue to bring it back. It's been banned, right? So you think, oh, it's horrible. What is this, right? What is so horrible in here that can't be read? It must not be read. What I'll do is I want to read this to you because this is what they would read. The students had to memorize. So the students that now go in to become soldiers from the get-go, they're given this imperial rescript. They have to memorize it. They say it pretty much every day. And it is literally the core, the foundation of their understanding of who they are as citizens. Because remember, Japan had been a collection of small Han, right, which are now prefectures, but they were Han back then. You had your daimyo, and then you were loyal to your daimyo. The daimyo then was loyal to the shogun. And then that was how Japan was ruled. Kind of like the states, right? People in America were loyal to New York or Michigan or Virginia or Louisiana. So our Civil War, a lot of people were the states, right? They were loyal to the states. And over a period of time, we had to kind of work that out of people. So we had to emphasize the national and de-emphasize the state. So this is a way that they would emphasize the national, right? So they had to do it in a very short period of time. And the imperial rescript during the Meiji Emperor's time was one of those mechanisms. That's why the emperor was so important. It was seen as kind of a unifying factor. All Japanese could agree that, okay, well, this is our constitution, our living constitution. And so therefore that unifies Japan and begins this idea of a unified nation state. So here's what it says. This is the imperial rescript that was made way back in the Meiji period. So, know ye, our subjects, our imperial ancestors have founded our empire in a basis broad and everlasting and a deeply and firmly implanted virtue. Our subjects are ever united in loyalty and filial piety, have from generation to generation illustrated the beauty thereof. This is the glory of the fundamental character of our empire, and herein also lies the source of our education. Okay, nothing controversial there. Ye, you, our subjects, be filial to your parents, affectionate to your brothers and sisters, as husbands and wives be harmonious, as friends be true, bear yourselves in modesty and moderation, extend your benevolence to all, pursue learning and cultivate arts, and thereby develop intellectual facilities and perfect moral powers. Furthermore, advance public good and promote common interest. Always respect the Constitution and observe the laws. Should emergency arrive, offer yourselves courageously to the state, and thus guard and maintain the prosperity of our imperial throne, coeval with heaven and earth. Okay, so you got to be filial to your parents, honor your mother and father. Well, that's a Jewish tradition, a Christian tradition. That's an American tradition. That's pretty much very Western. Okay, so maybe GHQ didn't want them to be loyal to their parents. I don't know. Affectionate to your brothers and sisters. That's also right. Interesting. Maybe like Ephraim and Manasseh. So in the biblical Western tradition, Ephraim and Manasseh were used as a Jewish blessing that you would bless your kids on in every Shabbat. Why? Because Ephraim and Manasseh were the first brothers that actually got along. So being, brothers and sisters, you getting along with them, that's actually a blessing. Well, that's there. So why is that different? Husbands and wives be harmonious. Okay, husbands and wives don't fight. How many? Why is that objectionable to American GHQ? And why did they have to be banned? As friends true, bear yourselves in modesty, moderation, extend benevolence to all, et cetera, et cetera. So far, nothing there. And in an emergency, okay, go to give to the state. Well, we said the same thing. In fact, look at World War I and II. It was actually much more jingoistic than this. So there's nothing in here that's saying, forget everything and just charge a headlong. All right, let's keep going. So shall ye not only be good and faithful subjects, but render illustrious and best traditions of your forefathers. The way here set forth is indeed the teaching bequeathed by our imperial ancestors to be observed alike by their descendants and subjects, infallible for all ages and true in all places. It is our wish to lay it in the heart of reverence and common to you, our subjects, that we may thus attain the same virtue. In other words, you'll be just as virtuous as the king and queen. What the heck? Okay, so that's it. So that's nothing in there that's saying charge ahead, nothing in there that says don't worry about anything, nothing in there that's too terribly bad. Now let's go over now advance. So when they leave high school, when they leave that, they go into the military academies, or they go directly into the military. Now they're going to have this, and this is the imperial rescript to military folks. They say the soldiers and sailors, but actually the word in there is gunji, so it's actually the military. But when you look at what it says, again, nothing in there screams, "Hey, this is absolutely horrible." In fact, so I'm gonna put it on here so that you'll actually see it in its English translation. Again, this translation was from a group that was not too, how can we say it? Not too friendly to the Japanese. So if there's going to be an kind of an angle for bias, it would be against the Japanese. So again, if you're not listening on the podcast, if you're watching it, you'll actually see some of these in here. But if you look in here, it basically was made in 1882. It was still in use before and during World War II. This is what the Japanese would have to read. And I'm going to show one more thing here. This is the book. So that little part in there, and this is from warrelics.eu, a great site. But this guy actually has a pay book. This is the official book that you as a soldier or sailor would have to have on you at all times. It's like your passbook. Your service record, your pay book is right here between his thumbs. All the rest of those pages that's your required reading. And then you would have to memorize that. You would have to write it. Just like this guy over here, he wrote his own version of it. You would have to memorize it. And at any moment, kind of like our general orders in the U.S. military, if someone came up to you and said, what is the imperial rescript on this? You would have to recite it by memory. It was inculcated in you. That was from the emperor. That was sealed in your pay book. You carried that with you at all times. This was the foundation of the code of conduct, so to speak, for the Japanese, what they were taught. Now, again, all human beings under certain conditions will operate in the same way. The American soldiers at certain times, under certain conditions, exhibited exactly the same characteristics as the Japanese did, right? In the Philippines, during the Moro Revolution, in Malay, in Vietnam, and during World War II in the Pacific Campaign. If you read Bringing Mulligan Home, some of the first-person accounts from some of the Marines that were being treated for, back then there was combat stress casualties, but later on we call it post-traumatic stress disorder, TBI, that sort of thing. Those documents were sealed, but now they've actually come out, and a lot of there was a lot of mass killing going on. There's a lot of killing of prisoners. There's a lot of killing of civilians. It's the nature of war, and that's what Americans don't realize. That's why Vietnam was so hard on America, because they took a glimpse inside beyond the propaganda to say, look, human beings in certain conditions will act in a certain way. It's up to commanders to rein that in, to keep control of it and mitigate it, but it will happen. There's absolutely no doubt. My Lai and many others in Vietnam. There was also in Iraq, a lot that goes on. So anyway, but you have to look at what was the training. Was it intentional? As Sarah Paine says, that there's some kind of Hagakure, this arcane book from a guy way back in the day. And Hagakure, by the way, is not in here. They didn't reprint Hagakure and put it in here. What did they have in here? Well, let's take a look at it. And again, this is from the translation in here. So we rely upon you, guarding the empire. So this is the preamble in here, okay? So in other words, you represent us, we represent you, okay? We expect much of you, soldiers and sailors. We give you the following. So here's the rules. That's the preamble. Let's go there, right? Soldiers and sailors consider loyalty their essential duty. Was born in this land can be wanting in spirit and graceful service to it. No soldier, sailor especially can be considered efficient unless the spirit be strong with him. Okay. The soldier and sailor in whom the spirit is not strong, however skilled in the art or proficient in science, is a mere puppet, and a body of soldiers or sailors wanting in loyalty, however well ordered and disciplined it may be, in an emergency is no better than a rebel. Right. So you got to be loyal and you got to be self-disciplined. Right. So you can be smart as heck. Right. But if you're not disciplined and you're not cohesive, is what we would call cohesion. In an emergency, you're just a mob, right? Remember that as the protection of the state and the maintenance of its power depend upon the strength of its arms. The growth or decline of the strength must affect the nation's destiny for good or evil. Therefore, neither be led astray by current opinions nor meddle in politics. Let's look at this again. Therefore, neither be led astray by current opinions nor meddle in politics. We'll also see a interrogation by the United States of Japanese admirals and colonels after the war, 1945, and they say the same thing, that it was absolutely wrong for the military to start meddling in politics. They shouldn't do it. But the organizational structure had set up a Navy political party and an Army political party. So even though the rescript was like we shouldn't, they still had it in there. So organizational structure dictates outcomes. But if you read the responses from the military personnel that the Americans interrogated, they thought it was distasteful. To get involved in politics is not a good thing. And keep in mind the September incidents during the 1930s, where the military, the army tried to take over, and they also assassinated some prime ministers and other folks. Every single one of them, there was the national public that wanted them away. The military wanted them executed. So, and none of them remained in the military after that. They were gone. The military didn't say, hey, we're going to cover down and protect those young lieutenants. Those were new folks in there, and they rebelled essentially against the military as well. So keep that in mind, that politics wasn't in there. Bear in mind that duty is weightier than a mountain, while death is light as a feather. So single heart, you fulfill your essential duty of loyalty, right? So in other words, what they're saying in the context now, because that's quoted a lot, that duty is weightier than a mountain, while death is lighter than a feather. Well, what they're talking about, it's very heavy, right? Death is easy, right? But duty is weightier than a mountain, because you've got to maintain your duty and you've got to keep this going, right? So that, taken out of context, makes it seem like the Japanese were just, ready to kill themselves, when in actuality, in context, no, it's talking about something completely different. It's very difficult to do your duty, and dying is easy, but living and doing the right thing is hard. Never by failing a more principle fall into disgrace and bring dishonor upon your name. Now that could be twisted later when they're trying to get soldiers to go forward and fight instead of surrender or retreat. But again, that occurs all over the place, no matter what kind of inculcation occurs. The soldier and sailor should respect the emperor and superiors, and have considerations to be shown inferiors to emperor. You should esteem valor to be here's an important one. Now, she says that the Hagakure says just charge ahead. Remember that? She's like, just forget tactics, just charge ahead, always go, take the initiative, go, right? That's what she was saying. However, again, nobody was reading, very few people were reading the Hagakure. It wasn't the official book. This is the official book. This is what was drilled into their head. They memorized it again and again from the beginning to the end of their career and after. The soldier and sailor should esteem valor. To be incited by mere impetuosity to violent action cannot be called true valor, right? In other words, if you're incited to violence, unlike the Hagakure, which is like, if you're incited, just charge. But if you're incited and you just go to violent action, that's not valor. The soldier and the sailor should have the discrimination of right and wrong, cultivate self-possession, and form their plans with deliberation. So I don't care what the Hagakure says. Some novel that was written, a history of a small Han written 200 years before World War II, that may have been in popularity because everybody was republishing old samurai books looking for something of Bushido, as they were looking back, much like we would look back on Civil War or Revolutionary War type of things. But this is what they had to read. This was their general orders. This was their code of conduct, right? This is their leadership values that were inculcated into them, and they were measured by, right? This is what gets you promotions. This is what keeps you out of trouble, right? This is what you're going to be grilled on, and therefore you're going to know it and you're going to internalize it as much as you can. And again, cultivate self-possession, form plans with deliberation. Never to despise an inferior enemy or fear a superior, but do one's duty as a soldier or sailor. That is true valor. Those who thus appreciate true valor should, in their duty, in their daily intercourse, set guidelines first, and to aim to win love and esteem of others. If you affect valor with acts of violence, the world will in the end detest you and look upon you as wild beasts. Of this you should take heed. So the emperor is telling them, hey, don't go crazy. But again, conflict of war, if you're put in those situations, you're going to act like wild animals, right? That's just the way it's going to be. And it doesn't matter what nation it is, everybody's going to do it. We did it, Russia did it, China did it, everybody does it, right? It's the nature of it, because it takes a heck of a lot of command structure and a lot of effort to not have human beings do that. And the U.S. had, in some theaters, the command of that area. They had air superiority. They had control of the battlefield. Even then, we had some slip-ups in discipline. But when that melts away, if we were in the same situation as the Japanese, I guarantee you we're going to act the same way. And we did. So having said that, Sarah Paine is not giving those young cadets in the Naval War College or the Naval College, or her students, they may not be cadets, they may already be ensigns up to captain, I believe. But she's not giving them the right ideas, because they need to know that their commands, you don't need a Hagakure to go insane. You don't need a Hagakure to just say, to heck with it, I'm going to charge ahead. You don't need a Hagakure to lose cohesion, confidence, commitment, and control of your unit on the battlefield. And that's a danger when she sits there and tells those guys that. She's setting them up for failure if they believe her, right? If they don't already know, and they haven't been deployed in combat, and they haven't studied on their own, they're going to be set up for failure. Hopefully they know enough that they kind of, okay, she's selling something here. So if you thoughtlessly agree to do something that is vague in nature and bind yourself to unwise obligations, and then try to prove yourself faithful and rigorous, you may find yourself in great straits from which there is no escape. So, and again, ever since ancient times, there have been repeated instances of great men and heroes overwhelmed by misfortune have perished and left tarnished name to posterity simply because in their effort to be faithful to small matters, they failed to discern right and wrong with reference to fundamental principles, or because losing sight of the true faith of public duty, they kept faith in private relations. You should then take serious warning by these examples, right? So looking at this, you can already see that's this Hagakure, give me a break, right? Simplicity aims, yeah. So nothing in here is talking about any of those things within Hagakure, none of it. So I'm not quite sure what she's talking about. So, and again, go on, get a translation of this. There's a couple different translations. They say the same thing, and there's a couple nuances in language. Some stick to the old ye, ye look at this, ye look at this. Some do the modern language, but take it, look at it, debate it, see if what we're saying is true, if you agree with it. Look at the Hagakure. You just have to read the first two to see it's a guy pining, but understand how it was written. Guy that was never at war, pining about the good old days when samurai could cut people's heads off, right? Because in Tokugawa period, you may get censored, right? You may get investigated for it because they were bureaucrats by that point. So it's like a soldier in peacetime. He's going to pine for the old days. I wish I could go to combat. The guy's never been there, okay, because he's wearing a uniform and he thinks, hey, I need to be there. So Sarah Paine's doesn't work. The other thing I would offer to look at, there's another good one here. There's United States naval proceedings. They examined all of the Japanese in China. So China was a big source of study for the U.S. military 1920s and 30s because it was an active war, kind of like the Spanish Civil War. People studied that for lessons learned. The armor, Aberdeen Proving Ground, folks were over there looking at, okay, what are the advances in armor? How's armor being used? Like Ukraine is today. Well, China was a big deal. And so a lot of observers, especially from the Navy had a fantastic overseas intelligence service, Office of Naval Intelligence. They were over there. Basically, most of your naval commanders were intelligence gatherers at some point because they were great observers of things. And the military really did a good professional job interwar. That's one of the things I think that gets lost in doing intelligence, the spade work, estimations, plans, assumptions, training on the plan, and then revising in that. But if you look at this is actually very, very good. United States Naval Institute Proceedings is the name of the magazine. You can go to the United States Naval Institute's website, and they still publish this. But go back to the 1920s and 30s and look at the articles of the United States military evaluating the Japanese campaigns in China. And what you'll see is that the Japanese do not rush headlong into things. They weren't going, there weren't all these banzai charges. There wasn't that thing unless they're desperate. They do have the capacity in mass to do that. But most of the operations, especially around Shanghai, were very much as the United States was taking lessons learned from that. Remember I talked earlier, the flanking maneuver around the Chinese Kuomintang, the 188th Division that had moved in and, cornered the Japanese at very similar to the Pusan perimeter. And then they flanked around much like MacArthur did, right? So if you look at the Korean War, very much looks like what Shanghai looked like. The Japanese were pushed against basically the seawall in the south, and then they did a flank, and then they pushed them all the way back up into the capital of Nanking and actually out of the capital of Nanking. But that's a good source there for some of the source documents. Again, there's a great website. Just go to the United States Naval Institute, look up proceedings, look at the old articles. You get a couple free, but then you have to pay for the rest. But if you're really into that history and want to look at the sources from the time, devoid of a lot of post-war political positioning, then that's the way to go, I would think. And that's important. But keep in mind that the United States was planning a war against Japan. So we were looking at it with an angle to how are we going to be able to beat them and counter them, because we had planned since, again, 1907. And every year we train on that plan and revise the plan. So it was very, very, very good about professionalism. The final thing I want to show is actually there's some pretty good websites here. And let me see if I can share the screen. I'm going to do one thing here. I've got a little Elgato screen deck, and I'm not quite sure if this will work. Hey, it works. Nice. These are investigation or interrogations of Japanese officials. So I'm going to share the screen with you real quick. And what this is actually from history.navy.mil. As I said, World War II was phenomenally documented. And there's a lot now that they've digitized, not everything, but a lot has been digitized online. And so you're able to go in there and get the source documents. Definitely get the source documents. Like I said, there's a lot of interpretation. There's a lot of kind of Sarah Paine-isms that come out after the war. And you kind of wonder, are we at war with Japan? Is propaganda still going? But these internal documents were pretty good about stripping away some of the propaganda that was there. They were more professional and just, okay, let's just get the facts and take a look at it. But the subjects here are just absolutely amazing. So they interviewed mostly the commanders, the naval commanders. So this focuses mostly on the Pacific. And they look at various campaigns. They look at various techniques, for example, mine warfare, things like that, the Tokyo air defenses, Guadalcanal. So you'll get everything that's in there. But you also get operational planning. You get what the decision was to go into Pearl Harbor. You get their decision or their opinions on it. And it's Admiral Yonai. There's Gomo's in there. Let's get some more in here. So, but again, I would definitely recommend coming in here. This is all free and a tremendous amount of source documents, again, where you can go in, take a look at it, see if you agree or not. And you'll find a lot of gems in there and a lot of things that are quite surprising. But it does speak again to the fact that, human beings, when you read these things, you recognize even more human beings act very similar in combat situations. I know I say that again, I'm going to say it many times, but it's very important. You have to understand that that is a big deal about the United States, is that we need to understand other people. We have the capacity for great good. We have the capacity for great evil. We're not this magical thing. We tell people back home that, but we need to understand under combat situations, we need to take control of our troops or our sailors. And those same stressors, those same bits of human nature will express themselves under stressful conditions, especially in hard combat. And so that needs to be taken into account. We need to go in that with clear eyes and understanding in our hearts. All right. This was Japanese War Plans and Peace Moves, 13 to 14 November 1945 in Tokyo was where the interrogation took place. The interrogation of Admiral Toyota, Soemu. And so this is his record. So he actually was in the right place. This is one thing you need to look at. Sometimes if you look at a person, they may have a rank, but they don't have position to actually understand certain things that they're being asked. So they're making assumptions about what they heard. So be very careful when you're doing that to say, okay, that person was in that command at that time, or later he took over command at that time and may have had access to that information. Just because you're a soldier doesn't mean you're in headquarters and you understand everything that the commander's decisions are making. Look at these guys and make sure that during that period of time that they were in the places that they are qualified to talk about. Now, they can still talk about it. They still may have heard about it. They may have studied about it, but always take that into consideration that they may be speaking on things that they don't have a personal witness to, and weigh your decisions and your judgments accordingly, put it that way. And so on this one, you'll see one of the big things about here when they're talking to the Admiral Toyota. Oh, and then this is who interrogated him. This is also important, right? So we know who interrogated him, Rear Admiral. So a Rear Admiral is interrogating an admiral. That's great, right? So he kind of understands an admiral does these sorts of things, right? So sometimes a captain or a Lieutenant JG interviewing an admiral, he doesn't quite understand everything, right? So if you have somebody around the same pay grade and responsibilities, they know, okay, this is something an admiral would know about or he wouldn't know about. So the questions are a little bit better usually. But a good trained interrogator, he'll know, the roles and responsibilities of higher echelons, and so he can ask questions on that. But during the World War II, sometimes that always wasn't done. Field expediency meant some captain was interviewing a general. Occasionally, we've seen those, and he was asking questions that a captain would ask, but a general, he wouldn't know anything about that. But going down here, notice that there were throughout the war positions. He wasn't fully informed of the progress of the war, plans and policies under discussion in the Supreme Council, Peer Headquarters, General Staffs. And he says, yeah, pretty much it's organizational structure. And that's another thing I want to harp on. When she says is they had no grand strategy, well, they did at certain levels. They knew that they had to stitch together economy. They had to stitch together these things, but two things prevented it. Number one, physically, right when they're about to get their economic base up in Manchuria, what happens? Well, a number of border wars. They go to war with Russia and Monhan, but before that, in 1937, they get enmeshed in a quagmire of China, right? And then the U.S. starts propping up Chiang Kai-shek. There's that united front that was forced on Chiang. The United States and the material aid to Chiang keeps the Japanese from being able to do a peace deal, and they continue to get bankrupt. 1940-41, we began to do economic blockades against Japan, and they're scrambling. So how can you integrate an effective economic plan when you don't have an economy, right? So, and a wartime economy at that. So they were already on the back foot. The other thing was there was definitely a separation between the Army and the Navy. And so when Tojo was in as the prime minister, the Navy wouldn't talk to him. So he wasn't thinking in terms of that. They were thinking in terms of settling China, and then we'll go do the stuff in the Pacific. So the Navy would operate in spite of some kind of inertia at the top, but there wasn't really coordination, except, interestingly enough, in Southeast Asia. So the move through Thailand into Burma, Malaysia, and Indonesia was incredibly successful because there was a rare moment where they did work together. And then they had a lot of civilians and diplomatics had actually moved in there, worked with Pibun Songkram, who was the prime minister of Thailand at the time, the Field Marshal Pibun, and had actually worked through those initiatives. And that was a rare moment of coordination where they actually were able to pull it off, because the scale of the operation didn't exceed the ability of the Japanese to industrial support it. The Pacific was just a massive amount of support needed as far as logistics, that the Japanese were already on kind of their last legs. I mean, they didn't have anti-tank shells when they had the border skirmishes with Russia in 1939, much less now they have to supply the 16-inch shells in mass for battleships. They have to fuel en route. When they don't have fuel, there's just a tremendous amount of issues that they've got to do. In addition to the politically, they're separated from the army. There's no chief of staff, right? That is one overarching, chief of staff like a marshal, general marshal, to say, okay, look, this is what we're going to do, and then work it out. And unlike the warlord Roosevelt, and Roosevelt was a warlord, he was very involved in the war, planning assumptions and where it was going to go, even to some smaller details he would become involved in. The Prime Minister Tojo was pretty much hands off. He wasn't even aware that Midway occurred. Many of them weren't. In fact, there was Admiral Nagumo was talking about earlier. I think I have to go back to that. But he basically said that if you were in the United States reading a paper, you understood what was going on, even though the censorship was occurring, because the information just wasn't getting back to headquarters. So it was really organizational structure that prevented them from doing it. It wasn't like they're looking at Hagakure. It wasn't that they were like, well, we could just focus on this concept of Bushido and we're going to win everything. That's not true. A couple of them said we need to leverage our lack of ability for an industrial warfare by focusing on, really hardcore kind of troops, but they know that wasn't going to win it. They knew that wasn't going to really do it. They just thought they could bloody Americans enough that the Americans would eventually get bored and do a stalemate. Now we laugh at that, but what happened in Vietnam? Exactly that. In other words, the Vietnamese were able to, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong were able to do enough, the NVA and Viet Cong were able to do enough, stay in the fight long enough that they were able to, eventually Americans said, okay, fine, we're going to negotiate a peace. And that's what the Japanese were doing. The only thing they had to go off of were previous wars. And in World War I, the Americans had just kind of sort of gotten in and they weren't able to mobilize a lot and go forward. They depended a lot upon French material and some British transports to get Americans over there. Japan, at the estimate of the situation, wasn't aware that the Americans had begun mobilization in 1933, and they've been training on that, and they already had a plan in place and trained on it. So they were very well ahead. So once the war hit off, we were able to go, almost from 0 to 100 almost right away. And the Japanese thought there'd be more of a lead time, that they had time to kind of wear it down. So again, looking through this, you can see that the country needed more time to avoid war, the presence of strong and wise statesmen who could have led the country at the time. Remember, they had 18 prime ministers, right? So government cabinets were falling and rising every year. And he literally said, we needed to avoid the war. We're trying to avoid the war. But the problem is again, the structure of the constitutional monarchy that they had, the Constitution, the prime ministers would just fall 18 within 2 years, or within the span of about 10, 12 years is not good. And that's why they were not able to take it. And Konoe, the closest guy that had a chance to it, wasn't very headstrong. He wasn't forceful, and he didn't realize when he's getting the runaround from FDR, and he didn't recognize sometimes you have to get public about it. You have to get the American opinion on your side to kind of force Roosevelt to the table to do this kind of negotiation so that we can avoid a war. And so he didn't. He believed in the Western system. He believed in, kind of the gentleman's rules, and it bit him in the butt. And so Konoe was sorely disappointed by the failure to be able to reach a détente with America and then come to peace. So some of the things they had to look at. So this is the American question. This is important too. It goes back to the Manchuria thing. In the early stages of the war, what was the opinion of the highest echelons as the probable major threat to the success of its plan? Was it forces in China? Was it possibility of Russians coming into Manchuria? Was it down in the Australia New Guinea area, the American forces there, or was it the U.S. forces in the east in the early part of the war? So in other words, what were the Japanese afraid of in the early part of the war? And then he says, of course, as already stated, I had no part in laying down war plans in central headquarters, but I personally felt that our biggest objective was, of course, the American naval and air force. So in other words, that was the biggest threat that the Japanese Navy saw. And that's why they had to take out the U.S. and delay it so that they could have a free hand in Southeast Asia. The Army, however, if you ask a general, their biggest threat was the Russians in Manchuria, even as they went up against the Germans. They thought they have a breathing room, but they expected at some point the Russians would come down into Manchuria, and that they did. And so, again, these are fairly good documents. Go through those. Highly recommend it. And it's all online and it's all free. But again, going through those, you're going to see a lot more information about what the Japanese actually were thinking, and they weren't charging headlong into banzai charges. That wasn't grand strategy. That was a tactical decision by commanders who were desperate, couldn't go anywhere, were cut off, and believed they would be shot if they were captured. Again, does the evidence support her assertions? The answer is no. Read the Imperial Rescript for education. Read the Imperial Rescript to the soldiers and sailors. Go through and read the interrogation documents from the United States right at the end of the war from the Japanese leaders about what they thought. Look at the politics. Again, read Konoye's translation of Konoye's diary. He was the prime minister right before Tojo that was trying desperately to try to avoid a war. What the negotiations were ongoing. And then some great books, like I said, two of them were Japan Prepares for Total War. Actually, I'll put them up here. Camera thing. Japan Prepares for Total War. That's by Michael Barnhart. And this is an excellent book, Cornell University Press. Search for Economic Security. And again, that's a good longue durée, 1919 to 1941, because a lot of nations looked at the lessons of World War I and came to the same conclusion. It's an industrial war, and they're going to have to get their industrial base up before they're able to engage in a modern war. So a lot of information is in there. His source documents, check out. As you see, everywhere there's a pink, that's where we have to go look at a source document to confirm it says what it says. And for his book, it's actually really good. The second one on the American plan to bankrupt Japan, or the shots fired before Pearl Harbor on the economic side, and it's not just oil, it was resources and finances, is this one. And this is Edward Miller, Financial Siege of Japan Before Pearl Harbor, Bankrupting the Enemy. Another excellent book to understand the financial trade. So, and this is the Navy Institute Press. So oddly right there in, so why Sarah Paine didn't read it, I don't know. Maybe she needs to go talk to Edward Miller a little bit. But another excellent book. And then the final one is the translation. Again, this is a leftist group put this out, but they don't, I say leftist, but leftists in Japan. So, they don't look at the Japanese in a favorable light, but they have the memoirs of Prince Konoye. And kind of avoid you'll notice it's very framing. They try to contextualize it in the introduction, which is almost as big as his diary. But he goes into, okay, this is the negotiating points, and they go back and forth on it. The other good one's the State Department. You can go in there, and they've declassified a lot of the material. So the U.S. State Department website, some of them have been digitized, some of them haven't. A lot of them haven't. So you have to physically go to the archives for that. But I would definitely recommend it because looking at the actual negotiations is very important, because you see what the issues were, you see what the United States was pressuring, you see what Japan was asking for. Those are the issues. And again, the final thing to take away from today before we leave is it's not all about a book that was about a pining bureaucratic samurai, about the old samurai that were fighting, Hagakure. That's not what informed military decision-making within Japan. So her case studies need to get updated. And then the Smoot Hawley America First Tariff, as she phrased it, did not in and of itself, or was even a major contributing cause to Pearl Harbor. There was a number of steps along the way, a lot of links in that chain that, if any of them had been different, would have prevented Pearl Harbor. And again, why is this important? Well, because it does a disservice when you're teaching young leaders the fantasy about World War II, and especially what the causes are, because these are going to be the decision makers going forward. And if they're living in a fantasy world that she's promoting on these little sound bites on YouTube, well, then we're going to be in a lot of trouble coming forward. And we got a lot of improvement that we need to do in our military, and it's not going to be improved if we keep doing this kind of fantasy thing. So, going to the retirement homes, making people feel good, maybe that's what she needs to be doing, but it doesn't need to be in our military academies. It doesn't need to be in our professional development. Definitely. We need more, clear-headed folks that are like, hey, this is the reality of it. You may not feel good, but you're going to have the information to go forward and do good and get people to do the right thing overseas so that everybody comes home alive and we don't keep screwing up foreign policy and military operations like we've been doing for the last probably 70 years. All right, there's the soapbox. There's the historical thing. So case closed on this one. Sarah Paine, definitely take it with a grain of salt. Definitely not supported by the facts. The real facts show a picture almost diametrically opposed to what she asserts. And again, go take a look at some of the source documents. Go take a look at some of the information that we have. Come back. If you don't agree with it, please debate us. Please show your information. We, as good investigators, will always take evidence. We always reevaluate the evidence. We will always look at it and update our findings on it. That's what's the difference between an investigator and a religious cultist is because, okay, we can update our assumptions and we can update our decisions and assumptions based on new evidence. Others will say, hey, the clock has stopped and it's settled history, which is ridiculous. Then you're in a cult. Anyway, have a good night. Hopefully that's helped. And again, if any questions, feel free to put the comments down here or send us a message at hq@historyda.org. Please feel free to visit our Substack. We put a lot of articles out there. Most of our articles tend to go out on X, but we are on other platforms just in case something gets censored or taken off the grid. Have a good night and be safe.